Welcome back. Zimbabwe, it's a country in the midst of an outbreak of cholera, food shortages, hyperinflation, and renewed calls for President Robert Mugabe to step down. Zimbabwe has strict media laws which prevent CNN, like many other news outlets, to report from inside. The World Health Organization has put the death toll from the cholera outbreak in the hundreds, and in recent days, several world leaders have repeated their calls for Mr. Mugabe to resign. Back in September, Robert Mugabe signed a power-sharing agreement with the opposition leader Morgan Tsvangirai. It included a pledge to ease press laws to create an open media environment. So, months on from the initial election, the runoff and the signing of that power-sharing deal, are all bets off the table? To discuss that, I'm joined from Johannesburg by CNN's Nkepile Mabuse. Here in the studio is Lance Guma, producer and presenter with SW Radio Africa, a station that broadcasts directly into Zimbabwe, and Alex Vines, the head of the Africa programme with London's Chatham House. Nkepile, first of all, in monitoring the media in Zimbabwe, have you discerned any difference between how the independent media and the state media, rather, have been covering the cholera outbreak?
Well, nothing about the state media has changed in Zimbabwe, regardless of what issue they're covering, Fiouannula. With the cholera outbreak, they are busy telling Zimbabweans that there is an outbreak now and the situation is this desperate because of economic sanctions. Now, you will remember, Fiouannula, that sanctions that have been imposed in Zimbabwe are against Robert Mugabe himself and his inner circle, not against the people of Zimbabwe. So this is the kind of line that the state media is pushing. And when I was in Zimbabwe, I can tell you now that nobody is buying that argument that sanctions are to blame for the food shortages, for the poverty, for the economic crisis in that country. Many in Zimbabwe are convinced that Robert Mugabe is solely responsible for all of their problems. But of course, the state media is still trying to push the government line and is essentially a government mouthpiece in Zimbabwe.
Lance Guma, you broadcast directly into Zimbabwe with Radio SW Africa. Let me ask you, has there been any difficulty or increased difficulties recently because of the cholera outbreak getting information?
Well, I just think nothing has changed. The government has obviously used repressive legislation to limit the media environment. But in terms of covering the cholera story, what has been of great difficulty is getting the actual figures of people who've succumbed to the disease. And I think even the World Health Organization figures that are being quoted, those are just figures of people who've been able to visit the health centers, but the true scale of the crisis might not be known because a lot of people are not even bothering to register the deaths of their loved ones. So I think nothing has changed in terms of that restricted media environment and accessing information.
Alex Vines, I mean, cholera has always been an issue in Zimbabwe, but is it the issue that the international community believe will force eventually Robert Mugabe to resign?
I don't know if it'll force the international community. What it does do is focuses the region, the neighbours, back onto the Zimbabwe question at the moment. Because the cholera is spreading. It's in Mozambique, it's in Zambia, it's crossed very much into the north of South Africa. So they're going to have to deal again with Zimbabwe from that point of view.
But as the international community makes calls this week for Robert Mugabe to step down, it doesn't appear that it's being heard, at least publicly in the media, by the African Union.
African Union itself says there needs to be mediation and that needs to continue. So you're right there. But the neighbours themselves have to deal with the cholera spreading. In terms of the international community, I'm afraid Gordon Brown, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, George Bush has both called for Mr. Mugabe to step down. But there haven't been so many other voices. It's civil society voices, it's bishops. It's like Archbishop Desmond Tutu or the Archbishop of York here in the United Kingdom for the Anglican Church who've been calling for him to go.
Nkepile Mabuse, I mean, has the cholera outbreak had any impact, as far as you can tell, on either the media lately in Zimbabwe or indeed politics in terms of violence? There's been an increase in the number of dissidents arrested recently. Do you believe it's directly related to the cholera, or is it business as usual?
You know, the cholera outbreak, it just, demonstrates to the world and to the region just how bad the situation is. Zimbabweans have been suffering for years. I mean, the fact that they haven't had water in Harare for nearly a year now, just explains just how desperate the situation is. And over this year, nobody has been reporting on the fact that, there is no water in Zimbabwe. The Herald, the state newspaper, only reported about a week ago that water had been officially cut off. But when I was in Zimbabwe in October, they were telling me that they hadn't had water, most areas hadn't had water for at least a year. So, yes, the cholera outbreak has brought a lot of attention to Zimbabwe, but I mean, the problems in that country go beyond cholera. They are much bigger. There's that food crisis. Nearly half the population needs to be fed by early next year. The economic crisis, 80% unemployment. I mean, there are just so many problems. And what regional leaders are doing at the moment is treating the symptom. They're treating this cholera. They're sending money. They're sending equipment. On the border between South Africa and Zimbabwe, the South African government has sent teams of doctors and of nurses to treat Zimbabweans who are coming through because they can't get medical help on the other side. But the real problem, the instability in that country, the political question in that country is not being dealt with adequately by this region.
Alex Vines, though, it raises the question of who exactly is Robert Mugabe being supported by internally. If there is no water in Harare, it hasn't been for a year, presumably even some of his most loyal paid supporters must be growing a little frustrated.
Oh, I think so. Even in March, we saw splits within ZANU-PF. You had the Simba Mokoni faction, for example, standing against Mr. Mugabe. So, yes, there are growing splits, but this is a very long-term endgame, I think.
And what about the role of the army?
The army is important. It was interesting to see that about 100 soldiers rioted on the streets of Harare recently. So again, it's indication of the growing tensions. But I don't think we can expect a imminent collapse. But it's degradation, it's gradual degradation.
Lance Guma, we've often heard about the will of the Zimbabwean people, how strong they are to withstand many different challenges and frustrations. As a Zimbabwean yourself, how do you feel about the situation right now? Do you agree with Alex that it's a slow process still to be continued of degradation?
Yeah, I mean, and just at a personal level, I've been reporting on this crisis for 8 years, 6 of those spent in exile. And just the level of frustration that I feel when I see events unfolding back home, I mean, it's too much to bear. And I think just condemnation alone will not secure any results. And it is very necessary for a paradigm shift. And I would want to agree with Kenya's Prime Minister Raila Odinga that something radical has to be done, because just condemnation of Mugabe alone will not secure any results. And I would want to answer the question that you raised earlier on about the abductions. I think the abductions are linked to the political stalemate, and that every time ZANU-PF does not get what it wants politically, they resort to their default mode of operating, which is violence. So they're using the abductions, trying to put pressure on the MDC to capitulate.
And when you talk to family and friends in Zimbabwe, have you noticed any change in their demeanour since the elections in March?
I think in September, when the power-sharing deal was signed, a lot of people were hopeful that this would be the end of their suffering, although this was not the full loaf they'd envisioned. But I think there was enough desperation to allow people to accept that deal. But as the months went by, Mugabe grabbing the key ministries and these abductions taking place, it has become very clear that Mugabe is not interested in a genuine power-sharing deal. So I think all that optimism has vanished. People are facing the hard reality that Mugabe is not interested in sharing power, and it's back to square one for Zimbabweans. But the problem is they can't express themselves, and and we pick this up easily when we're doing when we get calls at our station, or callback, giving our listeners a chance to express themselves. They won't even use their real names when talking to us. So that's the level of fear in Zimbabwe right now.
I mean, I found a question to you on that note, Nkepile. I mean, you've travelled into Zimbabwe, you've been up to the border many times. I mean, do you foresee yourself continuing to make the same journey still this time next year?
We have to, Fiouannula. I mean, I think even now we do not know the full extent of the suffering of those people. And when you do go to Zimbabwe, you realize why Robert Mugabe does not want the world to know what is going on in that country. We have to keep on going, and we have to keep reporting on the story for the people, for the sake of the people of Zimbabwe.
Nkepile Mabuse in Johannesburg, Lance Guma, Alex Vines here in London. Thank you both very much indeed. Well, troubles for the Tribune. The US media conglomerate files for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. Will it and others be able to survive in an environment where circulation levels and advertising revenues are in decline? We'll find out